War films usually tell you who the heroes are. Saving Private Ryan doesn't. Instead, it asks a question. If saving one man costs the life of many, was it ever worth it? And the uncomfortable truth is, it never gives you an answer. And that's why nearly 30 years later we're still talking about it. Saving Private Ryan did something to the war genre that had never really been done before. And strangely, as time passes, the film hasn't aged. It has settled, like dust after an explosion. When I watch older war films, like The Great Escape or The Sands of Iwo Jima, I don't think they are worse films necessarily, but I do feel distant from them. They belong to another era of storytelling, an era where war was simpler. Heroes were heroes, villains were villains. War films once lived in two dimensions, good and evil. But audiences changed, stories changed, and films began asking a more unforgettable question. Not just, who is the enemy? But, why do we fight at all? Saving Private Ryan sits directly on that turning point, because despite its Hollywood premise, a group of soldiers sent to rescue one man, the film is not really about saving Private Ryan. It's about something more, something far more disturbing. A question quietly hanging over every scene. How many lives is one life worth? Something interesting has happened to storytelling over the past few decades. Audiences no longer just want a villain. They want to understand the villain. We want to know where they come from, what made them that way. Films and television now spend just as much time exploring the psychology of monsters as they do celebrating heroes. And we see this everywhere. Stories built around characters who once would have simply been the enemy. Joker explores the slow collapse of a man into madness. The Penguin turns a Batman villain into the centre of a tragic crime story. Even blockbuster villains have sparked debate. When Thanos appeared in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, audiences argued over whether his motivations strangely made sense. And perhaps the most uncomfortable example of all came with Dahmer, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, a series about a man responsible for horrific crimes, a man widely described as a monster, and yet millions of people watched it and found themselves feeling sympathy for him. Not approval, not forgiveness, but something deeply human. Empathy. Because modern storytelling has become fascinated with one question. What makes someone become the villain? We no longer see evil as something simple. We see it as something human. Saving Private Ryan opens with something almost everyone recognises. D-Day. A moment in history that has been recreated, referenced, and remembered. But rarely like this, because before the film even introduces its characters, before we understand the mission, it asks us to witness something first. The cost. Thousands of lives lost in the space of minutes, just to take a stretch of sand, and immediately the film quietly returns to its central question. How many lives is something worth? Because here, the objective is clear. Take the beach, advance the war, push forward. And you could argue that this is different, that this isn't about saving one man, this is about winning, about territory, about momentum. And then the question becomes even more uncomfortable. If we can justify losing hundreds of men for ground, for progress, for the idea of victory, then what exactly are we saying a life is worth? And who gets to decide that? Captain Miller wrestles with this idea throughout the film, trying to make sense of the losses, trying to give them meaning. There's a quiet logic to it. If losing 10 men saves 100, then maybe it's worth it. Maybe that's how you survive it. But there's always another possibility, that this logic isn't truth. It's coping. a way to make something unbearable feel justifiable. And then the film shows you the reality behind those numbers. The D-Day sequence doesn't feel like cinema. It feels like something you're not supposed to see. Men don't fall heroically. They collapse. They scream. They panic. Some don't even understand what's happening. There are moments where the soldiers wander through the chaos, in shock, as if their minds simply refuse to process what's in front of them. A man picks up his own severed arm as though it still belongs to him. Another cries out for a medic with no one coming. And suddenly, war is no longer a strategy. It's not maps or orders or objectives. It's confusion. It's fear. It's survival. And what makes this sequence so overwhelming is that it doesn't feel staged. It feels remembered. Because none of this is happening by accident. Saving Private Ryan was filmed on Curacao Beach, a vast stretch of coastline transformed into Omaha Beach. I've actually been there myself, visiting family in Ireland, and standing on that beach, you understand it immediately. It's open, exposed, unforgiving, beautiful in a way that almost feels indifferent. The kind of place where something enormous could happen and leave no trace behind. Hundreds of extras, detailed period uniforms, landing crafts built to match the originals. Even many of the weapons were real, adapted to fire blanks. The explosions weren't just added later, they were triggered on set, timed, placed, close enough to feel dangerous. And that matters, because when the environment is real, the reactions become real. The camera doesn't sit back and observe. It moves through it, handheld, unsteady, almost struggling to keep up. There's a harshness to the image too. The colours feel drained, the motion feels fragmented, and that's intentional. It strips away that familiar, polished Hollywood look. No gloss, no comfort, just something cold, something distant, like an echo of the past. That comes from the way the film is shot, using a high shutter speed which gives everything that sharp, shuttering quality. It removes the smoothness we're used to and replaces it with something harsher, something more immediate. Even the sound design refuses to guide you. There's no clean sense of direction, just overlapping noise, gunfire, shouting, explosions, all fighting for your attention. That moment where the bullets tear through the water and everything goes quiet, muffled, distant. It's not just a visual choice, it's perspective. For a few seconds, you're not watching the battle anymore. You're inside someone trying to escape it. And the actors are moving through it all, real effects. The environment itself becomes another character in the scene, unpredictable, dangerous, unrelenting, real timing. No safety net of, we'll fix it later. The camera itself becomes a soldier, handheld, unsteady, sometimes struggling to keep pace. It moves with the men. You're not just watching D-Day, you're inside it, experiencing confusion, panic, fear. Every tilt, every shake mirrors what the soldiers would have felt in those moments. Steven Spielberg reportedly avoided rigid storyboards for this sequence. He wanted the chaos, the unpredictability. Not something perfectly planned, but something that felt like it was just happening. Because that's what war is. Disorientating, overwhelming, unclear. Even editing plays a role. Rapid cuts, overlapping reactions, and fragmented motion reflect how quickly and uncontrollably events unfold in real life. Spielberg refuses to let you settle into the scene. You can't predict, you can't pause, you can't look away. Every detail matters, from practical props to costumes, to lighting, sound, and editing. The illusion of war is complete. It isn't a spectacle, it's an experience. And maybe that's why this sequence hits differently from anything else that came before. When all these elements come together, something strange happens. You stop watching it like a film and start experiencing it like a memory. Older war films often frame death as something cleaner, something noble. But here, there's nothing clean about it. Nothing distant, nothing heroic in the way we've been taught to recognize. These men are heroes, but not because of how they die. If anything, the film strips that idea away entirely. Because after seeing this, after being placed directly into that chaos, you start to question something simple. Would anyone willingly choose this? The intention was never just to show war. It was to immerse you in it, to remove the distance between the audience and the experience. The camera doesn't observe from afar. It moves with the soldiers, shaking, unsteady, dipping beneath the water, rising again to reveal bodies drifting in the sea. You're not watching the landing. You're inside it, disorientated, trying to find your footing, trying to understand where the danger is coming from. The cinematography feels chaotic, almost uncontrolled. But that's exactly why it works, because war isn't composed, it isn't framed neatly, it doesn't give you time to process. What looks like mess is actually precision, a carefully constructed chaos, a beautiful mess. Because for the first time in a film like this, war doesn't feel like a story being told. It feels like something being remembered. And once the chaos settles, we're left with something else. The people who survived it. It's almost absurd when you think about it. The film spends nearly 40 minutes just getting off the beach before the story even begins. And yet, that is the story. If the opening of Saving Private Ryan shows us the chaos of war, then the characters show us what it does to the people inside it. Because this isn't a story about strategy, it's a story about men trying to make sense of something that just doesn't quite make sense. This video is sponsored by 3D Creations. Do you like nerdy stuff? Well, of course you do, otherwise you wouldn't have clicked on this video. We make 3D printed keycaps and other accessories inspired by a mixture of games and films. If this interests you, the link is in the description. And let's get on with the video. At the centre of it all is Captain Miller, a man defined not by what we know about him, but by what he chooses not to say. We learn very little about his life before the war. Fragments, a wife, a teacher, a past that he keeps deliberately out of reach. At one point he admits that he doesn't like to talk about home, because the more he thinks about it, the harder it becomes to do what he has to do, and that tells you everything. Miller isn't just leading a mission, he's managing a kind of emotional compartmentalization, a way of separating who he is from what he's required to become, because if those two things ever fully collide, the weight of it might just become unbearable. And that weight builds throughout the film. Every loss, every decision, every man who dies under his command, it accumulates, quietly, relentlessly. There's a moment where Miller tries to rationalize it. If losing a few men saves more in the long run, then maybe it's worth it. Maybe that's how you justify it. But even that starts to feel fragile, like a structure built on something unstable, because deep down, he knows this isn't just numbers, it's people. And that idea begins to fracture the group, because the rest of the squad don't see the mission the same way. To them, this isn't strategy, it's personal. They're being asked to risk their lives for someone they've never met. Characters like Reiben represent that frustration. He questions the mission openly, pushes back, because from his perspective, this isn't justice, it's imbalance. Then you have Sergeant Horvath, steady, loyal, the kind of soldier who doesn't need the answers, he just follows through. But even he feels the strain. You can see it in the way he supports Miller. Not because he fully agrees, but because someone has to hold things together. And then there's Upham, probably the most important character when it comes to understanding the film's psychology. Upham isn't a soldier in the traditional sense. He's a translator, an intellectual, someone who understands language but not violence. And he's dropped into a situation that demands something from him he's not prepared to give. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance in him, a conflict between what he believes and what survival requires. That staircase scene is probably one of the most uncomfortable moments in the film, because nothing is physically stopping him. There's no enemy in front of him, no direct threat, just a choice. Go up those stairs and become someone who can kill. Or stay where he is and live with what that means. And he freezes. Not out of cowardice, but out of something far more human. Refusal. His mind simply rejects the reality of what he's being asked to do. And while he sits there, someone else pays the price. But even that moment isn't simple, because the German soldier he encounters later lets him live. A quiet decision that complicates everything, because it reminds us of something the film keeps returning to. The enemy is still human. Now, Upham is meant to translate to the audience of the film. We feel how he feels. We understand, because we're in a similar shoes. We've never been to war, the average audience member watching this film. We understand what it's like not to fire a gun. We understand what it's like to be in an environment and world of chaos, where you don't really want to fight, you just want to survive and go back home. Then we have Jackson, the sniper, a character who feels almost separate from the rest of the squad. While others react to war with panic, frustration, or doubt, Jackson remains calm, measured, grounded. There's something almost paradoxical about him, because while everything around him is chaos, he operates in stillness, a kind of controlled focus that feels completely at odds with the environment he's in. And maybe that's what defines him, because being a sniper isn't about adrenaline. It's not about charging forward or reacting in the moment. It's about control. Control of your breath, control of your heartbeat, control of your mind. In a way, he becomes the eye of the storm, the center of the tornado, where everything is still. But that calmness isn't peace, it's discipline. A learned response to something that would otherwise overwhelm you. Because if that control slips, even for a second, it's over. And there's something quietly unsettling about that, because it shows a different side of war, not just chaos, but the kind of focus it demands from people, the way it forces them to adapt, to become something precise, something almost mechanical. Jackson doesn't look like he's surviving the war. He looks like he's functioning within it, and that might be just as disturbing. There's another moment earlier in the film that reinforces this. Two soldiers surrender during the D-Day landing. They're speaking frantically, pleading for their lives, but the audience isn't given subtitles, so we assume they're German, part of the enemy. But what they're actually saying is something very different. They're Czech, claiming they never killed anyone, begging not to be shot. And the film never tells us that directly. It lets the audience sit in that misunderstanding. Why? Because war doesn't give you clarity. It doesn't pause to explain context. Decisions are made instantly, and often incorrectly. It's a subtle detail, but it reinforces one of the film's most important ideas. There are no clean sides, no perfect moral ground. Just people, caught in something larger than themselves. Another memorable moment in this film is the knife scene, one of the most difficult moments in the entire film, not because it's the most explosive, but because it's the most intimate. War is often shown at a distance, through gunfire, explosions, moments where death is immediate and detached. But here, there's no distance, no separation. It's slow, uncomfortably slow. Two men struggling, neither wanting to die, both knowing that one of them has to. There's no heroism in it, no dramatic final stand, just desperation. And what makes it so difficult to watch is the closeness of it. Having to look someone in the eyes as you take their life. It strips away any illusion of being cinematic, because this isn't a spectacle, it's survival at its most raw. And as the moment unfolds, there's something almost unbearable about it. The pleading, the hesitation, the quiet human instinct to not do what's about to happen. But war doesn't allow for that instinct. It overrides it, pushes people into decisions they would never make otherwise. And that's what makes this scene so powerful. Not just the violence, but what it represents. Because this isn't two enemies facing off in some grand, dramatic confrontation. It's two people, reduced to something primal, doing what they have to do to stay alive. And that's far more unsettling than anything explosive. Even Miller reflects this contradiction. At one point he chooses to spare an enemy soldier, a decision that divides the group entirely, because to them, this isn't mercy, it's risk. But for Miller, it feels different. Not weakness, not hesitation, but a rejection of something, a line he doesn't want to cross. Maybe it's not about changing the war. Maybe it's about holding on to whatever humanity he has left. And that's what defines these characters. Not heroism, in the traditional sense, but endurance. Because they don't move through the film like invincible soldiers. They carry something much heavier. Regret, doubt, fear. In most stories, regret is something that comes later, at the end of a life, looking back, but here, these men are living with it real time. Every day, every decision, knowing that at any moment they might not get the chance to make another. And by the time the film reaches its final battle, something has changed. Not in the violence, that remains just as brutal, just as chaotic, but in the audience, because we've become desensitized to it. What once felt shocking now feels expected. And that might be the most unsettling part of all. Not what war does to the soldiers, but how quickly we, as the viewers, learn to accept it. Perhaps this is something that's already well known. I believe it is. I'm not saying anything new or groundbreaking here, but I do feel that as films have gone on, we've forgotten that message. We have forgotten what something like Saving Private Ryan has tried to teach us and tried to show us. By the time we reach the ending of Saving Private Ryan, we understand something important. There is no real victory here, at least not for the soldiers. This isn't a story about winning, it's about survival. And maybe by this point, the question isn't even what is morally right or morally wrong, but instead, what does it mean to do the right thing when everything around you is wrong? Because that's exactly what Ryan chooses to do. He stays. He doesn't take the easy way out. He doesn't jump at the chance to go home. He stays with his brothers, the only ones he has left. And that choice matters, because earlier, Ryan questions why he deserves to live. Why him? Why does he get to go home when everyone else has lost something? That empathy, that awareness, is what defines him. Now, realistically, this mission would never happen. No army would send a squad into the middle of a war to retrieve one man. But this isn't a documentary, it's a film. And documentaries give you facts, films give you meaning. This is a story that begins with death and ends with a life that has to justify it. And that brings us to Miller's final words. Earn this. It doesn't feel like a reward, it feels like a burden. A life lived under a question, was I worth it? And even we, as the audience, want to say, yes, of course he was. But the film doesn't make it that simple. Because it never actually tells us if the mission was justified. It never tells us if the sacrifice was worth it. It leaves that question with Ryan, and with us. And maybe that's the point. When we see Ryan at the end, older, standing in front of the graves, we see the life he's built, a family, a future, something good. But even then, he's still asking, still searching, still needing to know. Because the people around him, his family, they've lived their lives. But they truly can't understand what was given up for him to have that life. And maybe no one ever really can. That's what makes the ending bittersweet, because Ryan doesn't walk away free. He walks away with something heavier, not just survival, but the cost of it. A life that has to justify it. What Ryan carries isn't just survival, it's legacy. The legacy of men who fought, not just for him, but for everyone back home. And Saving Private Ryan carries a legacy of its own. A legacy that didn't just make it one of the greatest war films ever made, but one that changed how war is portrayed on screen. Because before this, war films often felt clean, structured, patriotic. Not wrong, but incomplete. They didn't always show the brutality, the confusion, the psychological toll. Everything felt a little too polished. And then this film arrived and confronted that idea head on. It showed audiences something they didn't even realize they needed to see. Not just war, but the experience of it. The chaos, the fear, the loss of control. It didn't present war as a spectacle. It made you feel it. A beautiful mess that films have been trying to recreate ever since. And after that, everything changed. War films didn't just try to entertain anymore. They had to convince you. You can see its influence everywhere, in films like 1917 and Hacksaw Ridge, in series like Band of Brothers. Even beyond film, its DNA spread into games, titles like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty, especially Call of Duty World at War. It borrowed that same perspective, throwing players into war, not as heroes, but as soldiers trying to survive. That opening on the beach, you can feel its fingertips everywhere. But the legacy isn't just visual, it's human. Because this film didn't just change how war looks, it changed how we understand the people inside it. It showed us that war isn't fought between heroes and villains. It's fought between people. People who are scared, people who hesitate, people who make impossible choices. And that shift matters, because for decades, the enemy in war films was often faceless. A uniform, a language, a target. But reality isn't that simple. And this film refuses to let it be. Even now, decades later, we're still asking the same questions it leaves behind. Because the world hasn't moved past war. If anything, it's a reminder that we haven't learned from it. Some people might say this film is overhyped, or even boring. But if that's the case, I think something's been missed. Because this isn't a film you watch for entertainment. It's a film that asks something of you. It asks you to sit with it, to question it, to carry it. I first watched this film when I was a kid, and now, watching it in my late 20s, I'm still asking the same questions. And I don't think I'm the only one. Because this film doesn't give you answers. It gives you something harder. Perspective. After this, you couldn't fake war anymore. And maybe that's why its legacy still matters. Because no matter the time, no matter the conflict, it always brings us back to the same thing. Empathy. But once the smoke clears, the film becomes something quieter. Something far more psychological. Because the real conflict in Saving Private Ryan isn't just happening on the battlefield. It's happening inside the soldiers themselves. These men are ordered to risk their lives to save someone they've never met. One man, somewhere in France, and suddenly the question becomes unavoidable. Is that fair? Is that moral? Is that worth it? And as the journey unfolds, the soldiers begin asking the same question the audience is asking. If one man survives and several others die, was the mission ever justified? The film never answers that. And maybe it shouldn't. Because in the end, the war doesn't end for Ryan. It just changes shape. It becomes something he carries. Something he lives with. Just like the men who didn't make it home. And maybe that's what this film has been building towards all along. Not an answer, but a feeling. That war doesn't end when the fighting stops. It lingers. In memory. In guilt. In the lives that continue. And the ones that don't. A life still trying to justify it. This isn't just a war film. It's a question, one that doesn't have a clean answer. And maybe that's why it still stays with us. Because even now, we're still asking it. I hope Ryan lived a full life. I hope he found peace. But if this film teaches us anything, it's that being human doesn't make that easy. Because we carry things, we question things, and we feel things. And maybe that's the point. Not just survival, but empathy.